Hi, everybody. We're just about to get started. Thanks so much for joining us. You're at Backyard Gardening with Farm Table Foundation. Good. Nice to see some faces there, lots of names, many that I recognize. So Farm Table Foundation has a mission of growing local food culture, and we do that through research, education, and training. Many of you are probably very familiar with our restaurant. It's our most public-facing expression of our local food mission. And in case you haven't been by in a while, right now we are really hard at work providing provisions and take and bake and curbside takeout food. So you can get a burger, you can get cheese curds, and you can get a frozen pot pie and a bag of spinach. So we're trying to provide all of those things that you might need right now. And if you haven't heard, we have seeds and we have yeast, which are two things that many people are trying desperately to track down right now. So come by and check it out. Thanks for your support through this time and also for your flexibility. So today's topic on backyard gardening will be presented by our on-staff produce manager, Sal Daggett, who's also a full-time farmer at Rooster Haven Farm. And she's got a lot of great experience and is just a pleasure to have in our class. So with no further ado, I'll turn it over to Sal.
Thanks, Laura. All right, so let's get started with this backyard gardening class. As Laura said, my name is Sal, produce manager here at Farm Table, and I also run Rooster Haven. We're a small, diversified, organic vegetable farm just south of Deer Park. We raise vegetables, fruits, herbs, poultry, chickens, ducks, turkeys, a little bit of everything. And this is our third year running the farm. We do CSAs, we do small farmers markets, and just some direct to retail stuff. So got some good experience with farming, but also I started out just doing really small scale backyard gardens. And that is kind of where I'm gonna come from with this presentation, just do a really broad overview of some of the main important things to think about, and then some of my own experiences. And at any point, if you have questions during the presentation, you can, on the bottom of your screen, there's a little button that says chat, and you can open up your chat bar on the right of your screen, and then you're able to type in any questions, and we'll make sure to review that throughout the presentation and hopefully get any questions answered that you have. So I am going to get our presentation started up here. We'll start from here. This picture I have is of my very first year as a gardener. So it was the year that I was 18. That was a few years ago. This is my 13th season, gardening, farming, doing all that good stuff. So I don't know, I turned 18 and I was like, now I'm an adult, I better start taking care of myself. And fortunately, my mom let me use some garden space next to her. And she kind of taught me a few things, but a lot of it I just figured out on my own. I made a ton of mistakes and did a ton of really silly things the first year. But as this picture shows, gardening is very forgiving. And I think you can do things in a lot of different ways and just have really great success. So this is kind of the height of my year where I was really proud that all the seeds that I'd planted actually grew and I was actually harvesting things. And it was just a very satisfying experience for me. So just starting out with that blast from the past, and then outline for our kind of little show today. I'm going to talk about some basic requirements for plants and just stuff to think about when you're starting out. We're going to talk about some maintenance, so keeping it going throughout the year, how to make sure that these plants are just thriving all season long. And then we're going to talk about troubleshooting for some issues that you might experience, some potential problems that we can head off before they become an issue. And then a few really important topics that I think are always relevant when talking about gardening is talking about soil health, because that is so important. It's really like the basis for all plant health and all healthy food. And then we're going to talk a little bit about companion plants and beneficial insects, because those are just ways to really have a holistic garden that is working with nature and with, all the things that you've got in your backyard rather than having to fight them so much. And then if there's time, we can also talk a little bit about the different plant families and just get kind of a sense of, what they need, what their different requirements are, and how to how to take care of them. All right, so starting out with our basics. So some basic plant requirements are just, sun, water, enough fresh air. So sunlight, you're gonna want at least half a day of sunlight if possible. So just thinking about your backyard, maybe your front yard gets more light, maybe you wanna put a raised bed in the front yard, or just finding what location you have that's just really sunny. And keeping in mind that if you're looking at it right now, we're early May, so a lot of our trees haven't leafed out yet. So what looks sunny right now might not be as sunny come, July or August. So just kind of taking a look at where, you've got and trying to figure out where a good spot is going to be for that. Water, so it's really important to have easy access to water so that you can easily get your plants watered and not have that become a really huge chore, especially when it gets really hot. So water, I just like to think, where's like the spigot on my house, and is there a way to really easily and conveniently place my garden space near a water source, or at least make sure that I can run a hose to it really simply. Or, if you just got containers or raised beds, maybe you just water it with a watering can. So then just making sure you have a nice sturdy, like at least a 1 gallon watering can, so you don't have to keep making trips back and forth. I would say the sprinkler, when you're on a small scale, and even with the farm that we've got now, we do a fair amount of just setting up a sprinkler and just letting that sprinkler take care of watering. We have them on timers, so we can just set it for half an hour and just get everything watered with, not a lot of input on our part. So spacing is something that I think is going to be a lot more variable than maybe people realize. So it helps if you have a lot of space. You can really keep these plants widely separated, give them a lot of attention. Otherwise, if you have limited space, like we can make it fit. You can fit a lot of plants into a small space. So that we can talk a little bit more when we talk about garden styles. And then again, healthy soil. I'll just keep emphasizing this throughout the presentation. Healthy soil is going to be the #1 most important thing for having healthy plants. Basic garden styles, I would say mainly are you gonna go in ground, kind of the classic in ground. We've got raised beds, container gardens. Otherwise, there's a little more specialty styles. So square foot gardening is something that would be interesting to look up if you have really limited space. That is a style of gardening that you put literally every single plant, it will fit in 1 square foot or less. So that's some really intense, compact plant growing. Otherwise, vertical gardening, is just maximizing your vertical space if you're limited in your horizontal space. So that requires, using trellises and other systems to just get your plants up off the ground. And we're not going to go into hydroponics, but that is always an option if you really want to tinker around with gardening. And indoor gardening is something that you can also do, and it's easy with some small plants. But if you have grow lights or you have a really sunny south-facing window, you can probably get away with growing some vegetables indoors as well. So I just have a few pros and cons to think about if you're thinking about getting your garden established. So the in-ground is how I started. It was just kind of the easiest, is just dig up, a spot and plant the seeds in it. So it's nice because then you didn't really want your garden there, you can just get on it, return it to lawn. It's not a lot of investment to set up, so it's a little more flexible from year to year. Some cons are planting into the ground means that you're now competing with all of the weeds that were growing there. Well, they weren't weeds prior to that, they were just your lawn, but now that you're trying to grow vegetables, they have become weeds and they are going to compete with your vegetables. And also it is a little bit of a physical adventure to try to set up your garden if you're trying to remove lawn. Raised beds are nice for a couple reasons. They are generally less weedy. They're also a lot more accessible if you have some mobility issues, or just if you're, getting older, if you're dealing with any sort of I don't want to be down crouching, on my hands and knees for a couple hours every day. I'd rather work at a really, nice level. So raised beds can be really helpful for that. They can look really nice. You can have really decorative raised beds that are very attractive, and you can also kind of fit more things into a smaller space. Some of the things to think about with that is that it's going to be more startup cost. You're going to need to, get the materials, find your plans, and then you're also going to probably need to purchase soil to fill them because they will take a decent amount of soil. Here's just a few kind of styles of beds that we've done. So on the left here, you can see we've actually done a terraced garden in one of our locations that was on a slope, and that one just looks really nice and is kind of utilizing that space that otherwise you wouldn't want to put an in-ground garden if there's a decent slope, because you're just going to get erosion. So then this other one is kind of one of some of our shorter raised beds. They're kind of half raised beds. So you can use really any materials or supplies to get those raised up. And then finally, container gardening is a really fun thing because you can do it with pretty much any containers you have around. So you can do it with just any old recycling containers or buckets. They're really small. You can fit them in any sort of space. You can just tuck a few, container tomato plants or pepper plants, or even, have herbs, and just put them wherever. So really low maintenance other than watering. And you are going to need, again, to purchase soil. So that would kind of be your input cost. And I think we're going to talk a little bit about the bed design process once, now that we've thought about like the different styles of gardens, and you probably already know what, if you're going to have a garden, what you'd like it to look like. So I would just say every year can be different. And for me, especially, every year I'm moving things around. I'm just changing orientation, changing how I want to grow things. I think that's something about this is just 1 year, and you can do it completely differently next year. So just design it on what you want to do this year and what space you have and how much effort you want to put into it. So it can be whatever you want it to be. And if you are converting your lawn to garden, I've got a couple different styles here. We won't go into them too much because we want to save room for all the other topics. But these are things that would be great to look up on the internet if you are interested in knowing more about these specific techniques. If you are determined to convert your lawn to garden. And there is a website I have in resources at the very end of this presentation that is specifically focused on some of these techniques. Just an overview of tools. So there's a couple different hand tools, and then there's a couple different standing tools that you might want to have for gardening. So I'd say definitely having at least a shovel, a rake. You might not necessarily even need a hoe, but you're going to want a shovel. I guess if you're doing container gardening, you need a lot less tools. So container gardening or raised bed, you might only need some hand tools, and that's where your trowel or your hori-hori, which is going to just be your general digging tool. That's going to get you everything from putting the plants in to taking the weeds out. That's pretty much going to cover it. Otherwise, if you are working in the ground, then some of these longer handled tools are going to be really valuable to you. So shovel, rake, maybe a hoe for cultivation. And then ergonomic tools are really awesome. I've got a picture of this green handled little trowel down here. Is really ergonomic. It's really nice and easy on the wrist. So there are a lot of different companies that are offering tools that are designed to fit, every kind of physical need. Starting plants is kind of a daunting task. So I just wanted to overview this. Some plants are going to be better as transplants. So you're going to, especially here with, our climate, we are a little bit more of northern growers. So some of these plants, we just don't have a long enough growing season to start them from seed in our gardens. So these are going to be, if you just think about bigger plants, what's a bigger plant? That's going to kind of give you an idea of what's probably going to be more helpful to start out as a plant. So your tomatoes, your peppers, broccoli, cauliflower. I also have herbs and flowers in this list because sometimes they just grow so slowly that you're going to want to give them a head start and get them as plants when you put them in. Versus direct sow is any fast growing plants or small plants. So lettuces, your root crops, radishes are, I think, the fastest growing vegetable. They are ready to harvest in 25 days. So those ones, it's just fine to sow them, just the seeds, and also root crops do not play well. So that's a little bit, you don't necessarily want to mess around with that. Greens grow really fast, so they can be good for direct sow. beans and peas, corn, okra, that stuff is big, but it also grows fast. So that's gonna be a little bit better to start out with seeds. And then squash and melons are something that I always start from seed, but you can also have really good results if you get transplants. So we just don't necessarily have the space to actually get them started with our little seed starting location. Otherwise, if you've got space or you're buying them from a greenhouse, then that can really help jumpstart your season. And finally, I've got clones here because they're kind of that weird thing that you don't plant the seeds, but you don't really plant like a plant. So potatoes, garlic, and onions, you're planting, it's a clone. It's just a smaller part of a different plant. So those ones, you're gonna go to your nursery or your farm store, and you're gonna get like a seed potato or seed garlic or seed onion, and it's just gonna be a small plant. Seed starting, it's probably a little bit late to do seed starting yourself. Maybe there's a few, probably the squash or the melons, you've still got time because they like it to be really hot when they're planted out. Otherwise, next year could be the first year, it could be a great year to think about seed starting. That's something that usually gets done between, say, February and March is when we seed most of our plants for planting out then the next year. Direct sowing, I think the important things with that is making sure your soil is ready to go, making sure you've gotten the weeds out of it, making sure it's this really nice, workable, easy to work soil. And then really to sow them, all the seed packets are gonna have the directions that are gonna tell you, how deep to put the seeds. So you can dig yourself, just a little trench and drop the seeds in. It's gonna tell you the spacing on them. So it's pretty much just follow the directions for different seed packets and, cover it with soil and water in. So that's pretty simple once you have your bed prepped to direct seed things. And then when they grow up, you might see that they've grown really thickly and you have to thin them out a little bit, but which is just fine. I feel like this is a really low impact form of planting. Whereas transplanting is a little bit more involved because you only have so many plants, so you don't want to mess it up. So that one, you're gonna, again, just want to have a really nice bed to start out with really easily workable soil. And you're just gonna dig this hole that's a little bit larger than the root ball of the plant, so like the container that the plant's in. And then when you take the plant out, it's really important to make sure that the roots look good. If they're, you want to have them like loosened up so that they're able to really start taking off and growing and expanding. If you notice more root than dirt, then you probably have a root-bound plant, which is just fine as long as you make sure, it's gonna grow no matter what, but it's gonna grow a lot better if you kind of break the roots up a little bit, if you pull them apart so that they're a little bit more spread out, then they're not just wrapping around each other, they'll be able to start growing in different directions. So just kind of keeping an eye on that as you're planting them. And also if you have really leggy plants or spindly plants, or plants that just didn't quite get enough sunlight when they were starting out and they're just really tall and kind of falling over. With a lot of them, you can actually plant them deeper than where they are in their pot, and that's gonna help them, help prevent them from getting snapped by the wind as they're getting adjusted to life outside. So those ones with tomatoes, if they're really spindly, I will just dig the hole deeper and I will just plant that tomato pretty much up to right below the first set of leaves. And that's gonna help keep the plant a little more compact, and then it'll start growing a little more bushy now that it's outside. And for planting out, in general, in Amory, Wisconsin, our last frost date is May 20th. So we are just about 3 weeks away, and we are really eager for that day. We've got a lot of plants we wanna get in the ground. There are some varieties that you can plant weeks before if you're familiar with what are cold hardy plants. So peas, a lot of greens, lettuce, spinach, a lot of root crops because they're gonna take so long, in germinating that by the time they're up and decent size, they're gonna, we're gonna be past the frost date. Potatoes and onions also do just fine in the cold. And then there's a few varieties that need it like extra hot, and you're actually probably gonna wanna wait until after the 20th. You might even wait until the first week in June. So that's gonna be your green beans, your squash, your melons, okra, if you like okra. I like growing okra, it's a southern thing, but those kind of plants definitely want the soil to be 50, 55 degrees before you plant them. And really the key with all of this is you just want to keep it really well watered while things are getting established, and also weeded as well as you can, but just making sure that your seeds, you're keeping them pretty moist as they germinate, and that's going to help them all germinate. And then as they get established, just making sure they're getting an adequate amount of water. And then as the plants get bigger, you can, hold off a little bit on watering as they get more adjusted to life outside. But weeding is also really essential so that the plants can get big enough that then if later in the season you kind of are a little bit more lax about weeding, the plants are big enough that they're going to be able to outcompete any weeds. And I think we're going to pause for a second and maybe take some questions here.
Hey Sal, just a couple questions coming in. Clarification on what zone we are in.
Yeah, that is a great question. I think we are in zone 4. Well, we're definitely zone 4. We're kind of on the edge of it, and it's tough because I'm down in Deer Park and we used to be right on the edge of zone 4 and 3. So I would say that Amory, if you're in this area where I physically am, but everybody else is out digitally somewhere. So we're in zone 4, either 4A or 4B. I forget which goes over the other ones. But anyways, we are the northern edge of zone 4.
Thank you. And can you plant garlic this time of year?
Interesting question. So garlic you generally want to plant in the fall because it needs that period of cold in the winter for it to, because you plant just one clove and then that clove is going to turn into the bulb with the multiple cloves next year, and it needs that period of cold for the clove to turn into multiple cloves. However, you can always experiment with putting garlic in your refrigerator for 6 weeks in the spring and then planting it out. And I did that last year and my garlic did all turn from one clove into bulbs. That's only if you want to get experimental with it. Otherwise, if you just have some cloves and you want to get them in the ground, know that they will just be one clove at the end of the summer. And if you leave them in, next year, you'll be able to harvest good garlic. So that was kind of rambling, but I hope
that's really fun. That's interesting.
Yeah.
And then a little troubleshooting question here. Someone says that they've already planted in the ground and they've planted some various herbs, watermelons, and peppers, and added a bit of soil. And they say, my leaves are starting to have holes and they appear to be struggling. Any reason why, or any solution to that issue?
So herbs, watermelon, and peppers, it might be a little bit early for them, but that shouldn't be causing any holes. The holes might be flea beetles, which are kind of an early season pest that like the cool weather. If they're really tiny holes, that might be what it is. Usually the plants will outgrow that. They'll grow fast enough that they're gonna eventually be stronger than that, and it'll just be a little bit of damage. And otherwise, I would say they might be struggling just because they are a little bit cold this time of year. So something you can do is try to create a little warm, tiny greenhouse for them. So whether by putting up some plastic over them, or you can there's something called a cloche, which is if you take a semi-transparent milk jug and then put it over the plant, and it's going to create a little bit of a greenhouse environment in there. So I would say if you can just try to keep them a little bit warmer as we catch up. I mean, today it's supposed to be 70 degrees, so they're gonna love that, but just trying to keep them a little bit warmer in the night, I think is gonna help a lot.
Thanks, Sal. Tracy says she took over an existing community garden plot and it looks like broccoli is coming up. She says, is it a perennial?
Broccoli is an annual, and if it is an open pollinated broccoli, it's possible that it has seeded itself from last year. Otherwise, broccoli is in the brassica or the cole crop family, and that is one of the most just diverse plant families. So it could be many things. If it looks like broccoli, it could be broccoli or broccolini. It could be a wild mustard. It could be radishes, turnips. There's a lot of things it could be. So if you know, if you want, you can let it keep growing and see what it turns into.
Tracy, let us know what it turns into. That sounds pretty cool. Julie's saying, I have winter sowed some seeds in shallow depths in plastic lettuce containers. Do I need to transplant them into deeper containers before they go outside into the dirt?
I would say that depends on how the plants look. If they're doing just fine in the shallow container, then you probably don't need to worry about it, especially because I'm thinking you'd probably be planting them out pretty soon. Otherwise, if you're going to wait a couple weeks and they're really looking crowded, then you can plant them into a deeper container and they'll, you know, be able to expand and get a little bit bigger before you plant them out.
Thanks, Sal. That's all the questions for now.
Okay, sounds good. Well, we're going to move on into some maintenance topics now here. Oops, let me. Okay, should be sharing screen again. So now we're going to talk about watering a little bit, because I think watering is one thing that going from a gardener to a farmer is something that we have struggled with because there's so much more to water. But watering is really essential, especially early on as your plants are getting started. And then later in the summer, when we get these like super, super hot weeks, it's just going to be so helpful to make sure that your plants are well watered. And I would say just kind of a general rule is you can do it twice a week. You can get away with twice a week for a lot of things. Of course, if you're growing in containers or if you're growing in raised beds and the water's just draining out, if they're really well-drained soils, you might need to water maybe 3 times a week, or depending on the size of your container, you might even be watering every day for ideal plant growth. However, if you want to take a little bit more of a hands-off approach, twice a week is probably going to be fine most times in the summer. And of course, if it's rainy, then you don't need to water at all, so you don't even need to worry about it. And it's important to water deeply to get a really, really good soaking, not as frequently, rather than just lightly watering things constantly. And that's mostly just so that you can train your plants to have really deep roots. If you're watering them shallowly, they're going to keep their roots at the soil surface and they're not going to really be delving down. And you want their roots to be deep because that's going to help them defend themselves against any really windy weather, any drought conditions. The deeper roots are going to be able to find more water, and they're just going to be sturdier plants. They're going to be able to just draw more nutrition if they have a really well-developed root system. And again, there's a lot of different ways that you can water depending on your setup. So I'm usually an advocate for sprinkler for backyard gardeners because you can just set it and let it go and not worry about it. You can really get a broad area deeply watered in less time than it takes if you're doing it by hand. Otherwise, it can be kind of nice to do it with a hose. I've been watering our hoop house with a hose, and that's like a good half an hour every day just watering it. So that can be kind of meditative for me. So, whatever works for you. Weeding is also really important, and it's going to be a little bit easier if you're doing raised bed or container gardening. There's probably not going to be as many weeds. Of course, there will be some that are blown in on the wind, but those should be kind of small and not too bad to deal with. Otherwise, if you're in ground, then you might have to deal with some more challenges. So hand weeding is something that I think if your parents gardened when you were growing up, you were probably as a kid forced into doing some hand weeding, and that, have memories of out there in the hot days, just digging at grass and whatever else annoying plants are out there. There is another technique that I love that I've learned, in the last couple years, which is cultivation. And that is where you're not concerned with removing the entire plant, the entire weed. It's that you are disturbing the weeds. You're just kind of breaking them up and, snapping them off when they're small, and then you can just leave them there. So it's a lot quicker way to weed, and I really enjoy that. That works best with annual weeds. So with little tiny weeds, weeds that are just growing up from seed, things that don't have really big root systems, then you can just, you can use a hoe, you can even use a hand tool, and just make sure that we're snapping the weeds off pretty much. And you can just leave them there and not have to try to remove everything. Otherwise, perennial weeds are going to be those weeds that have deep, long roots, and those are the big challenge to remove. Those we try to get the whole plant out, because otherwise the root is just going to start growing again. So those ones we try to keep out of the garden, and then makes it a lot easier to deal with just the small annual weeds. And weeding is something that, I don't know, we do every day if possible. In a smaller garden, I'd usually go out maybe 2 or 3 times a week and just doing, anything from half an hour to a couple hours of weeding, just depending on what it looked like out there. One thing when it rains a lot is your plants grow really well, but so do the weeds. So, keeping that in mind is after a rainstorm, you might want to go out and weed after a couple days. Mulching is another thing that I think a lot of people are thinking about. So you can mulch between your plants, you can mulch, in the rows, and mulch is just, all it's doing there is it's smothering weeds. It's kind of creating a nice environment. It's gonna hold more water. You're gonna have less water evaporating from the soil. So mulching can be really beneficial if done right. Otherwise, it can be kind of annoying. I've got a couple examples of some substances that are a little bit tricky to work with. So I am not a fan of landscape fabric because it might work really great the first year, but the next year, those weeds are gonna start growing through it. And then it becomes not so good. Same with plastic. If it's not designed to be a plastic mulch, if you're just like using a tarp, over time I found that can just start degrading, and the weeds start growing into it, and it just becomes a mess. So I am really a fan of any sort of mulch that is going to naturally break down. So I love straw, I love cardboard, I love layering cardboard and then straw or hay or grass clippings on top of that, because that is a really nice mulch. The cardboard really helps smother weeds and really helps hold in that moisture. And then the straw makes it a little bit nicer to walk on, and also just adds a little bit extra layer there. And then these mulches are going to just naturally decay into the soil. So they're going to add extra organic matter. They're going to actually start like creating more health and nutrition in your soil as they degrade. So yes, you will have to periodically add more mulch. Usually once a year we'll add more mulch. But it's really nice for the soil. It helps soil building, and then it also does help retain water and keep those weeds down. Otherwise, if you don't have mulch, like that's fine. You'll just have to do a little bit more weeding and probably a little bit more watering. Composting, I think, is something that just comes up because gardening is going to create, you're going to create plant matter, you're going to create extra organic debris, and it just seems really counterintuitive to me to be throwing that in the garbage. If you could just be saving it on your own site and letting it break down and then taking that dirt and then feeding your plants with it. So it's just the whole circle for me. So composting can be anything from a pile. Many of my many compost areas that I've had are either in a pit or in a pile. So that's just really simple, throwing everything there, and then periodically I'll just stir it up with a shovel. So some really low impact kind of compost areas, and usually those I'll only dig from once a year. So I'll go the whole year just throwing things around, and then the next spring I'll pull out any good soil from it and then go around and just kind of add that to my garden beds. One thing, if you want to do really intensive composting, is you can stir it more frequently. So if you have a system like this setup where you have kind of raised bins, then you're able to get in there, you're able to stir it. You can water it, so you want your compost to be moist and you want it to be stirred, and as you stir it, it will heat up, and that's going to help those plant matter, just is going to help it decay and break down and go back into this really nice rich soil. So to do that effectively, you're going to want more kind of brown things than green things, and that just has to do with the carbon-nitrogen ratio. So brown things are going to be like sticks, dead leaves, pine needles, like any sort of woody thing, cardboard, newspaper. Just don't use anything that's like shiny or has like too much colorful ink on it. But anything like that is going to be this good source of carbon. And then anything green is going to be any, recently alive plant matter. So all your plant scraps, all your weeds, things like that. And just trying to have a good ratio, a little bit more brown to green, but that's hard because we produce more greens. But I'd say anything, if you're throwing them together, any plant matter, any of these materials in an area, you're going to be able to get compost out of them. It just might take a little bit longer. But yeah, that can be a good thing to do to, figure out what to do with all your scraps and not get them off site. Keep your fertility in your backyard where you can keep using it. Okay, and I think we're gonna pause again for some questions here.
Thanks, Al. Super interesting. Thank you so much. A question on mulch and garlic. Does garlic like mulch? And if so, how deep should that cover be? And then as we're talking about mulch, another question about using leaves for mulch and using straw versus hay for mulch. And the specifics around the leaves there, it's oak leaves. So can you use oak leaves, straw, hay, and how deep should you mulch garlic if you should mulch garlic?
Yes, so I mulch garlic in the fall. I think it's really important to wait until August to mulch it, and that is so that you don't get rodents trying to build little winter nests in the straw. So I'll plant my garlic, a couple weeks before it really starts frosting hard, and then after the ground is pretty hard, then I'll put a layer of mulch on. I've done anything from maybe 1 or 2 inches to like 4 inches, or probably 4 inches of mulch. And just as long as you have a little bit of mulch, that's gonna just help protect the plants and keep them from heaving when it starts thawing in the spring. Yes, I think that answers that question. And then I would use leaves for mulching in rows, absolutely, especially if you're not spraying any like pesticides, or you're not worried about that, which is sometimes a worry if you're getting leaves from like city cleanup things, is that you don't really know where they're coming from. But if they're from your own trees and you know what has been done in your backyard, and they're just some nice, good, healthy, strong, organic trees, like that sounds like that's going to be some amazing mulch or just some amazing addition for your compost bin.
That's so helpful because there's always the question of what to do with those leaves.
Mhm.
And we can keep the carbon in the ground. So a question about what to grow, vegetables specifically, with a plot that has only 4 hours of full sun exposure. Do you have any suggestions? Is there anything that can do well in that setting?
So I would say greens are going to probably do pretty well. Greens are going to be okay. Peas maybe, because they like it a little bit cooler, so the shade might help them. Honestly, you could try anything, and I think you're just going to have plants that are going to be maybe a little bit more spindly. They're going to be looking for that light, so they're going to kind of be stretched out a little bit more, but you still should be able to get fruit, to get produce from them. But yeah, I would say anything that is kind of a smaller, shorter, faster growing plant might do a little bit better. Maybe try some radishes or some beets, or just like little root crops. I know that we've grown, a decent amount of stuff in the shade, and it's, we've done squash in the shade, and squash actually does pretty well. So maybe you could give that a try too.
Thank you, Sal. And then a final question here in this segment is about composting. So I think like Linnell, like a lot of us, keep a little, bucket on the counter with food scraps until she dumps it into the compost pile. But at that point, it gets a little bit moldy. Is that a concern, or is mold from your household compost okay to add to your large compost pile?
Yeah, absolutely. Mold is great. Mold is not great for us, but mold is something that some of the microorganisms in the soil will actually eat. Like that is great food for them. So yeah, that is something that's perfectly fine to get there. And really organic or decaying or whatever, as soon as you get it in the ground in contact with soil surface, there are just so many microscopic like detrivores that just love eating and decomposing things. So yeah, that's awesome.
And then the straw versus hay question, sorry to go back to that.
Yep.
Is there a difference? Is one better? Are there any concerns with one or the other?
Yeah, so I've used both, and it is true if you have some really weedy straw or hay. I mean, if there's anything that has a lot of seed heads in it, that could potentially be planting weed seeds in your garden. So that I think is a little bit more like, do you know the source of your straw or hay? Can you look at it? Like, do you recognize any of these weeds? There's one year we got a batch that had a lot of this like curly dock, which, you know, can grow to like 4 feet high and just take over. And my mom just like freaked out that I brought all this like hay in with all these weed seeds. So I had to try to pick them out. So yeah, it can potentially be an issue. Otherwise, sometimes if I have some really bad stuff, but I want to use it up, I'll just layer it super thickly so that any seeds that are falling through probably aren't going to be able to germinate. So I would say, yeah, if you can do a visual inspection and just try to utilize the stuff that doesn't have a lot of seeds in it. And if it does have a lot of seeds, maybe just compost it or just put it somewhere where, you know, you're going to mow over it or not be trying to grow them.
Thanks. A couple more questions came in while you were addressing that one. A question about when asparagus might be popping up. She's asking about asparagus that was planted last year. And then the other question is about someone who's bought a house with raised bed gardens and hasn't gotten around to weeding it yet. So they're pretty weedy. What's the best next move? Dylan's asking, tilling, fabric sheeting, maybe mulch.
Yeah. So the asparagus question, if it was just planted from crowns last year, it's going to take a good like 3 years for the asparagus to get really truly established and be fully producing. So it might be a little bit slower in coming up these first couple years. Our asparagus, I think it was last week, started emerging from the ground, but these are plants that are about 16 years old. So you should expect maybe your first year plants to be a little bit slower, and they're probably going to be a little bit skinnier, so maybe a little bit harder to see. And then they'll just keep getting better as you take care of them. Year after year, they'll produce more. And then the raised bed gardens, you know, I would say go in and see how easy the weeds are to move around. Because if they're raised beds, sometimes go in and pull them out in like a sheet, you know, if their roots are kind of tangled together. So even just physically removing them could be, you know, potentially an easy task. Otherwise, if they're really embedded in there, they're really hard to get at. You can try covering them with a tarp. You'll probably want to leave that on for a couple weeks to really kill them. Otherwise, if you leave it on for just 2 weeks and just kind of get them, you know, get them so that they're a weakened plant, then they might be a little bit easier to pull out. Otherwise, if you can get a tiller in a raised bed, you can like till it all up and then just pull out any big chunks of weeds. So I think there's a couple different ways, and it's just, you know, dependent on how deeply they are stuck in there. And then, of course, you're probably going to want to, after you get them out, just supplement with some nice sterile soil on top that you know is good quality.
Thank you, Sal.
Mm-hmm. Should we go back to the presentation? Okay. Now let us move on to troubleshooting a few issues in the garden, or just some things to think about. So we have some potential pest problems. So pests can be anywhere from insect pests, birds, rodents, deer if you're out in the country, sometimes in town. Rabbits are a lot more prevalent in town. And even if you have pets or boisterous children, they can actually be a significant pest in your garden. So I would say some of my solutions I have listed here. Birds, you know, birds haven't been really a bad pest. Even with my fruit, I just haven't lost enough to birds to be willing to we've tried putting bird netting up and it was really ineffective. So I'm like, just let them have a few strawberries or whatever and not really worry about them. We have a decent amount of good native habitat. So native birds are kind of more interested in eating the insects than the fruits. For insects, we don't do any sprays, any sort of synthetic chemicals, because we don't want to put that on the food we're eating. So we utilize a lot of companion planting to try to attract insects that are going to take care of any pest insects. So we plant a lot of herbs and just like really fragrant flowering plants. Anything in the carrot family, like flowering carrots or dill, or I'm trying to think now, celery, but anything in the Apiaceae family attracts these predatory wasps that are really good at killing the larvae of a lot of insect pests. For rodents, hopefully you don't have a bad rodent problem. We deal with gophers occasionally, and we just use the manual trap to deal with gophers. But usually rodents aren't too big in just a garden setting. Deer and rabbits are an ongoing challenge, and I found that fencing is honestly just physically keeping them away from the garden is the best way to deal with them. So deer are terrible because they can jump really high. So we have a fence that's about 4 feet high, and then we've got posts, corner posts, and we have an extra wire that's strung up at about 6.5 feet high. And we're just doing this weekend, but we're gonna attach some duct tape streamers to that. So anything that's moving around, that's like rustling or making noise or making movement is going to intimidate them, and they're not gonna be as likely to go and jump over your fence and eat your crops. And rabbit fencing, just want to make sure that the holes in it are small enough to keep the rabbits out. It's kind of surprising. Some of the like woven wire fences, they can really squeeze through some small holes. So finding, and you don't have to do a wire fencing. Got a picture here of, just as long as it's pretty tight, you can use like just a fabric fencing or a plastic fencing. But just to, physically make it so they can't get in there, hopefully is going to deter them enough. Otherwise, you can always plant marigolds. We plant marigolds a lot around things because that's supposed to be one of the plants that is going to be a deterrent to pest animals. So anything that has this really strong, kind of pungent smell is going to be not as attractive to them, which is why our garlic bed that we have planted outside our fenced-in area doesn't get predated on by deer. They kind of walk through it, but it's just such an off-putting smell that they're not interested in it. So those are a few ideas. Otherwise, there's a ton of resources out there about different creative pest management, solutions, and that's just kind of based on what you're currently dealing with. Weather, I think that weather poses a pretty terrible and unexpected kind of threat. A couple years ago, we had 2 hailstorms in this area within, I think, like 10 days, and they were just devastating to some of the farms around here. The hail just came in and just, pulverized all of their young plants in the spring. So the weather is something that we can't really predict. We just have to kind of deal with. So that can be anything from really hot, really wet, again, just like this physically aggressive if you have hail. Otherwise, like last year we had up a little bit north of here, but just those incredible windstorms that are just knocking trees down. So if a tree falls over in your garden, like that's not going to treat your plants very well. And, even things just like drought, just the lack of rain. So kind of both ends of the spectrum can be a threat to your garden. And I would say the best thing you can do to can't control the weather is just to cultivate your plants. So trying to make sure that you have really good soil and really, your plants are strong, they have deep roots. Minimizing bare soil is going to be helpful to prevent erosion in these rain events. It's also, if you have this layer of mulch, if it is hailing, like potentially that's going to be kind of cushioning your plants a little bit. And just, having a diversity of plants, having, maybe things planted in a few different locations. So if you have a little in-bed garden, but you've also got some container plants, then, if the hailstorm's coming, you're like, at least I can put these containers in the garage and save these plants. And, a lot of times, even if part of your plant snaps off, the rest of it's going to come back. It's going to keep growing. It's going to keep making fruit. So it's pretty amazing how plants are, how strong they are and how able they are to recover from some of these incidents. So that's kind of what I have to say about weather is we live in an area where we're going to get some bad weather. So you just want to help those little plants stay as strong as they can so they can withstand anything. And again, soil health is going to be really, really important for having these thriving plants. So yeah, if you have really small plants, if they're just not growing very well, if you notice discoloration on the leaves and it doesn't look like a pest is at them, it just looks like, the plants just aren't getting the nutrients they need, or your fruit is, falling off the plant before it's ripening, or, a lot of times tomatoes can get this blossom end rot, or peppers can get that where they just get black or moldy or soggy around the very bottom of them. And that, that can have a lot to do with like nutrient deficiencies. So just not having enough good stuff in your soil. Or just, yeah, really, really dry soil. It's just way too well drained. You're just not able to keep enough water to keep the plants strong. And that is all going to be, you know, you need to build up your soil health. You want to build up all of the strength of your soil, and that you're going to be able to do by adding organic matter. So that is, you know, any sort of plant things we're turning into compost. I have put half composted things when I just ran out of compost, and I was like, I need to make the soil better. So I just take, you know, these like slightly decomposed weeds, and I'm just putting everything, just incorporating it, digging it under into the soil, and just putting some mulch on top, and then noticing that over the course of that season, you know, it's starting to really turn into soil. The soil is getting darker in color. It's holding together a little bit better. And that's just something that your efforts and time is going to help improve that soil health. Otherwise, there are fertilizers you can buy. You can go and buy yourself some really nice compost. I'm just cheap, so the whole time I'm like, do it myself, but go there and just compost and just kind of skip that waiting step and incorporate that into your soil. There's like fish emulsion or seaweed-based fertilizers that you can just add into your plants and just kind of boost that soil health and just help those plants get a little bit stronger. But you just, you know, it's a process to make your soil healthier and healthier. And this is a picture of a terrible time a couple years ago. This is just evidence that our soil was not doing well. So if you see, the surface is just really cracked and dry. And what that is, it's just a sign that we didn't have enough organic matter. We'd grown in there for too many years and not added back enough you know, material to strengthen that soil. So what it's doing is it gets really hard on the surface. That means the water is not going to be able to penetrate. It's not going to be able to really, you know, have enough moisture for the plants to, you know, do well on. It's also just the water, a lot of it's just sheeting off when it rains. So it's just kind of eroding and not going anywhere it needs to go. So in this situation, it was like we had to get some compost in there, get some mulch in there, just get more organic matter in there. And eventually it looked a lot better than this. So that's just something to take a look at. If your soil doesn't look good, you know, then there's probably something you can do to make it look a little bit better. So just trusting yourself and your growing intuition with these plants is you grow the plants and you grow your understanding of what they need as you know, go through the season. And then I think we're just going to go through a couple more slides and then we'll get to any final questions. So these are just a little bit more maybe advanced topics, but things that I think are really important to bring up. So companion plants are just any sort of nice flowering plant, or it doesn't even need to be flowering, but these are plants that benefit other plants when they're grown nearby. So a lot of herbs, a lot of like culinary herbs or native herbs, things that are used in like traditional herbal medicine, are oftentimes they're good companion plants because they are attractive to insects. So they're going to be bringing in a lot of native insects that, you know, can take care of any of these like pests that you might be having. They'll also help with your pollination. So companion plants are just really cool, and I don't know, I mess around with them a lot. There's a lot of resources out there that you can find that are going to tell you, you know, grow nasturtiums by potatoes to deter potato beetles. Or again, like I was saying, things in the carrot family are going to bring in these predatory wasps, which are going to be helpful for, you know, like some larval predators of like tomatoes. So there's a lot of information out there on companion plants. There's also so I just have to reference this book, Carrots Love Tomatoes, that talks about, you know, vegetables that you can plant very closely together because they are so supportive of each other. I've not read the book, but I have seen a lot of synopsises and got a lot of information from people that are really fans of, you know, planting these vegetables that are super compatible together. So that might be something, especially if you're working in a smaller space, that you'd like to know which vegetables are going to do really well together. And this kind of ties into that companion plant, is, you know, the flowering plants and the insects are going to be really attractive to each other. So beneficial insects, like you know, when you first transition, or as I did, from kind of a more inside kid to like, now I'm gonna go and be a gardener, I had to learn a lot about insects and that they're not like bad and gross and scary. And there's a lot of things that if you find in your garden, that's great. Like spiders are great because they're gonna eat other pest insects and they're not gonna eat your, you know, any of your plants. They don't worry about that. You know, butterflies and moths are really cool. And there's just a lot of, you know, a lot of like little flies and bees and wasps that aren't really out there to be a threat to humans. They're like way more out there looking to eat other bugs. So it's kind of a live and let live learning experience. So when you get those really floriferous plants, a lot of flowering plants, they're going to be attracting more and more insects. And that is just going to help with natural pest control. And also you need pollinators. So not just, you know, these predatory insects, but you need pollinators to have really good fruit set. So that is like all those plants that require some sort of insect to help the pollen move around. So it's really important to get those flying critters into your garden so that you know that you're able to produce as much fruit from your plants. You can have really big, beautiful tomato plants, but if you don't have bees, you're not going to have tomatoes. So that is something else really important to try to incorporate into the garden. And now here's just a big list of resources. So I will just highlight a few ones that I find like really useful. So for seed companies, I love Seed Savers Exchange because it is all open pollinated heirloom seeds. They also have really good stories about their seeds, and they have the exchange, so you can find really rare varieties of seeds if that's what you like to grow, which we always like to grow some really funky stuff. So I love checking out the exchange for just, you know, plants and seeds that people have been stewarding for dozens or hundreds of years. Johnny's Selected Seeds is a little bit more aimed at the commercial grower, but I think it is amazing because they have a resource library that just, it goes over growing every single kind of plant, all sorts of pest control issues, different unique tools to use and different techniques. So if you go to Johnny's Selected Seeds, you can go to the grower's library and just have this immense amount of resources at your fingertips. And then some of these other seed companies are just some of my favorite seed companies. And then some tools and supplies, you know, the local hardware store is probably gonna have some decent supplies for you, some decent tools. Otherwise, if you're looking for like ergonomic tools, you can find them online. I know Radius Tools and AM Leonard have some really nice ergonomic tools. And again, with tools, you do want to pay for those a little bit higher quality tools, because it is really frustrating if you have, I bought some $6 trowels that I just regret because, you know, if you have a little bit less lower quality tool, then it's not going to do very well in any suboptimal conditions. So I've just gotten to the point where I'm like, buy a good tool. It's going to last you for years and years and years and years, and it's going to be worth it. And then for websites up here, I have the University of Minnesota Extension. Their Yard and Garden website is amazing. And I wish I was more familiar with the Wisconsin Extension resources, but being so close to the Twin Cities, I have used this Yard and Garden page all the time when I just have a quick question. They have on their homepage, they have a thing, or they've got one section that is like identify this pest, and they've got another one that's identify this disease. So if you just have just a little bit of information on something that's affecting your plant and you want to know what it is so you know how to deal with it, this website is really great to, you know, identify these problems and solve them. In addition, they just have, you know, again, a wealth of resources about every sort of gardening topic. Love Mother Earth News, that is a great magazine and also has some great online resources. And then this lawntogarden.org is just to help you get started, you know, if you want to convert that lawn to a garden. And then books, you really can't go wrong with books. Just anything and everything about gardening is probably going to give you some pieces of information. Some of these books, Seed to Seed is a little bit more advanced if you want to get into seed saving. Carrots Love Tomatoes if you want to know which nice, you know, companion plants to do. And then just, yeah, like a guide to organic gardening or any of these like beginner's guide to organic gardening, I find are super helpful because they really talk about this holistic gardening style. And so before we take some questions, I just want to say thank you for joining me on my second ever virtual class. So it's been an interesting experience, and I appreciate you taking the time to join me virtually and ask these good questions. And hopefully you've picked up some interesting ideas to inspire you as you go into this gardening season. And down in the bottom here, I have some more information on our farm is Rooster Haven. If you want to check us out online or visit us, or just check out some of our cool pictures that we like to post, the information is there. And with that, I think I'm going to end the show, and we will finish up with some questions.
Sal, thank you. You are floriferous. It's been lovely. So we have a few questions and a shout out to milkweed, Monarch's only food source.
Mm-hmm.
So where we see milkweed, a good opportunity to protect it or to sow that too. And then container gardening with potatoes. Just some general questions. How many eyes, or should she put the whole potato in the pot? How many potatoes per square foot of space, please?
Yeah, so I guess it would depend on your container size, and I would usually cut the potatoes, so making sure that they have maybe 2 or 3 eyes, and you want them to be like at least bigger than a golf ball size. So if they're a pretty small potato, I just leave them whole, but if they're a really big potato, then you can always cut them. And then make sure to cure them for like 2 days before you plant them, just so they don't mold. Per square feet, potatoes, because they are such a heavy feeding plant, I would say you probably not want to do more than 1 per square foot. So if you have just, maybe like a 10-inch or 12-inch pot, you might just want to put 1 potato in that, and then maybe just supplement it with some additional like compost or any sort of organic matter as the season goes on, so that it has enough nutrients to grow those nice potatoes.
Sal, a question about raspberry bushes. When should you thin raspberry bushes? And a few other questions sort of related. Do you need to plant asparagus in a trench? And how do you grow sweet potatoes? I can recap those for you if you want. Let's start with thinning raspberry bushes.
So I usually do that in the dormant season. I usually do that actually kind of the really hard part of the winter is ended. So sometimes it's just a little bit easier for me to work in there without the plants, being full of leaves. And also it can be a little more helpful to preventing any pests that get in them. Though raspberries are pretty hardy. And if you had a really overgrown thicket and you really wanted to get it pruned, I'm pretty sure you could do it any time of the year without too much danger to the plants. And asparagus.
Asparagus, do you need to trench them?
So it's been a while since I have planted asparagus crowns, but I'm pretty sure that they do want you to plant them fairly deep. So if it's easier to just dig holes, I think as long as you have dug a pretty decent hole, and it's deep enough, it's as deep as they request you plant them, that should be just fine. And just make sure that that soil is like really nice and loose when you pack it in around them. Otherwise, if you can do a trench, I think a lot of times you just do that trench. So you just drop the crowns in, cover them up a little bit, and just, move on. And
Sweet potatoes.
Sweet potatoes are tough for the northern growers. I'm doing them again this year. I'm trying a bush variety. Most sweet potatoes are going to be a vining variety. And what's unique about them is every time the vine goes out and touches the ground, that's where it's going to put down another sweet potato. So it's not the same as, just a typical potato where they're all growing under the same main plant. The sweet potato is like kind of expanding and growing sweet potatoes here and there. The first year I did it, it was really successful, and I'm not entirely sure why. It was good soil, and I think it was, was probably pretty easily worked. So for a lot of the root crops, they want that looser soil. So a little bit more sandy soil. If you have like a really clayey soil, that's going to be hard for them to grow big roots. So sweet potatoes, you buy them, it's, I guess, kind of like a transplant. You buy them in slips. So there's going to be some living top parts and then a little root. And that, you just plant the root in the ground with the leaves out there in the sunlight and water them in. And you just want to make sure not to give them too much nitrogen, because that's going to really make the tops grow well, but not the roots grow very big. So you're going to want to put a little bit more phosphorus then to strengthen that root growth. Is, I think, what I have to offer on sweet potatoes. They're tough, but sometimes they work, and it's really satisfying.
Thanks, Sal. And then a question about growing milkweed. One of the guests says that they tried growing milkweed from seed and it didn't work. Do they sell starts? How can you grow it? Yeah,
milkweed question, and a funny story, because milkweed can be a really annoying weed once it takes off. So milkweed is a plant that it loves disturbance. So it's, they call it an early successional plant. So if you're just starting with like bare soil, letting any weeds come in, like milkweed is going to take off. It is going to do super well. But then if you try to grow it yourself by seed, it is really tough to start. So I just have to say that, because we have milkweed growing everywhere, and it is crazy. We have a lot of butterflies, but we also have to remove the butterfly larva. Anytime we want to weed a milkweed plant from the farm, we have to like take the caterpillars and rescue them. So I would say, yeah, if you can get some small seedlings, which I would imagine you could get at a local nursery. If you've got a nursery that specializes in native plants or has a native plant section, they'll probably have milkweed, just because it is such a vital plant. Yeah, I would start with that, and then you can either save the seeds and try to plant them again the next year and see if you have some success, or let it go to seed and just spread those seeds around where you'd like milkweed to grow. And in my experience, it's going to soon start a nice patch for you. And let's see, yeah, so disturbed soil, so you just don't want a lot of weed competition. Usually full sun, it does best, but I've seen it grow pretty much anywhere. And yeah, I think that answers
Zoe recommends that you can buy it at Dragonfly. They sell 2 to 3 different species of milkweed, and she's had success with that. So that's a good tip. Thank you. There are a lot of guides to organic gardening online. Is there one that you recommend, or maybe you could put the screen back up, Sal, that you had on with your resources? And then a question about fertilizing. When you plant seeds directly in a raised bed, when would you start fertilizing it, and how often? And you might want to speak to what sort of fertilizer you'd recommend. And then also on soil composition, a question about if it's okay to use potting mix in raised beds.
Yeah, so I'll address that one first, because that one I should have mentioned earlier is potting soil is going to be okay for a while, but eventually it's going to kind of lose that fertility as the plants are taking it up and using it to grow themselves. So I would maybe supplement that potting mix with like a bag of just, an organic compost or some sort of like decomposed, a lot of times it's like turkey manure or something, but it's completely decomposed. So I'd say if you could add something to that potting mix, sphagnum moss, but just kind of mixing it around so it's more than just that potting mix, because that could get exhausted quickly. Otherwise, if you do just have a lot of potting mix in your raised beds, I would say just try to add in some compost throughout the season, just so that it doesn't completely deplete the nutrients. And for fertilizer, that would definitely depend on what kind of fertilizer you're using. So as I would recommend using just like a naturally derived fertilizer. So yeah, like the seaweed fertilizer we use a lot because you can get it in liquid form. And I would follow the directions on whatever your particular fertilizer that you're using is. So they're gonna, make recommendations for how many times a year you should apply this. Sometimes they say, they do like to say, apply this as much as possible, but if your plants are doing well, you might not need to fertilize them as often if your soil is doing really well. When you start fertilizing it, you would want to wait until the plants get a little established before you're going to start fertilizing it. So you're probably going to want to give them 2 to 3 weeks to get established. You don't want to start fertilizing them before their roots have had time to settle in and start growing. So I think that would answer that.
And then your favorite author on organic gardening, or favorite website on organic gardening?
Yeah, I would say I really like to trust any sort of like .edu website, so anything produced by a university extension, because they are, that is all that they do, is find science-based information to help you, so that those can be more reliable than just like Uncle Fred's Backyard Organic Gardening Bonanza.com. So I would say, trust those like resources, the university resources. Online, I'm trying to think, I think it was so long ago when I started gardening that everything I learned was in books. And that was just like, I went to the local library into the, that gardening section and just checked out like 10 different books and then just like flipped through them until I found ones that I liked. So I don't have really a specific one that is my like go-to resource. I'm also really intuitive, so I kind of like skip some steps or just kind of go out and try to experiment with, what I'm growing myself and then see how that works. So I'm really have to rein myself in when you're looking for resources. So that's why I say find those good science-based resources so that you can know that you're getting accurate information. Mother Earth News or anything that has been doing this for decades, since before organic was cool. Any of these really long-lived organic gardening guides are going to be, they've been doing it since the 70s, so they're going to be just a wealth of knowledge, of historical knowledge of how organic gardening has evolved over time. So I hope that gives some ideas of some resources.
Sal, how deep does a raised bed garden need to be?
Yeah, good question. I would say it depends on if there is interaction between the raised bed, between the soil in the raised bed and the ground itself. So there's no, rule for how deep it needs to be, but if it is a hard surface, if it's not interacting with the ground, it only has the soil that's in the raised bed, then you'd probably want it to be, a foot, maybe to 2 feet deep, just so there's enough soil in there that it's going to be providing enough fertility for the plant if it's completely isolated. Otherwise, if you're leaving the bottom open so that it can interact with the ground, it can be as high as you want it to be. It can be 6 inches off the ground. It can be 4 feet off the ground, but you're going to have to put a lot of soil in there. But that way, you're going to have this interchange between the soil, that soil environment, and the soil that you put in your raised bed. So you're going to have worms coming up, bringing nutrients up from the soil into your raised bed. So that's, it can be a little bit more flexible then for how big you want it to be. Otherwise, if you've got one that, is up on stilts, then yeah, I would say maybe like a foot or 2 of soil and just, put it whatever level is comfortable for you.
Sal, thank you so much. There's a lot of accolades and appreciation and inspiration flowing in on our chat log. So thanks so much for sharing your really vast knowledge in a really accessible way today. It's been lovely to hear from you.
Great.
And a shout out too to Sal and her CSA farm. So Sal, do you still have shares available? Are you planning out your summer? Are those available, and how would people get in touch with you?
Yes, thanks for asking. We do have a couple CSA shares still available. If you were interested in them, you could check out our website. You could send us an email. And that is, our email is roosterhavenfarm@outlook.com. Our website is www.roosterhaven.com, or you can always connect with us on Facebook. So if you're interested, Farm Table is one of our drop sites.
Thanks again, Sal. And to everyone online, thanks for joining us this morning. And we look forward to seeing your faces in the restaurant and in the Learning Center again soon. And thanks for your flexibility and your willingness to join this online journey with us. Take good care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.